see some familiar faces. So good to see everybody here. I think probably everyone's been to Van Winden's before, but if you're not familiar, we do have bathrooms. They're on the far side of this building, so if you need to get out to do that, that's how you do it. You are welcome to take pictures or notes or whatever you want, but we will email this out to you if you'd like at the end. So hopefully that helps you out. You don't have to, spend too much time writing. What other housekeeping things?
Questions at the end.
Okay, so we have sections that we're going to go through. The way we're going to try and do it is have questions about that topic before we move on to the next topic. Depending on timing, we're going to keep doing that. If at some point we start running too long, we'll just wait for questions at the end. And we might end the official presentations, but just talk to people one-on-one. Yeah, can people hear me in the back okay? Yeah, okay.
Perfect.
Very good.
Also exit right there, and in an emergency, we have an exit back here as well.
Yeah, that door is being sticky today, so you might have to muscle it, although we got 2 muscle people in the back to open the doors for us if we need. All right, so my name is Aileen Carroll. I am one of the managers here. I am absolutely a vegetable enthusiast.
I'm David Shubin. I'm the seed buyer for Van Winden's, and I love vegetables.
This is no lie. All right. So today's topics, we're going to talk about what you can and should be planting in the spring, where you should be planting these things. David's going to talk about bed prep, seeds and seedlings. I'm going to talk about spacing. We're going to talk about common pests, harvesting, companion planting, products to use, and then general tips. So I want to start off with a quick raise of hands. Who is going to plan on growing in containers or raised beds? Whew, is anyone growing in the ground? Okay, I grow in the ground. David grows in containers, so this is
A little bit of all three.
Any other quiz questions we wanted to do?
Not yet.
Okay. All right, then moving on. First, we're going to talk about David's garden so you can get to know your presenter here.
So I grow a little bit unconventionally. Most of my produce is grown aquaponically. So I have a vegetable bed that's about 5 feet long, 2 feet wide, with mosquito fish in a water tank down below. It's constantly flowing water through. Fish provide the waste for my produce, and then the produce then cleans the water for the fish. In turn, I use about 90% less water than conventional farming, and I get, in the peak months, about a 50-pound harvest monthly.
It's a very clever system that not very many people are doing, but if you had a very small space and you're basically getting a little bit of fish emulsion and fish. An example you see on the screen here, this is if you were to pluck like a little vegetable lettuce plant out of his setup, the roots would look just like that. No dirt on them because they're growing in water and mica.
Which is light expandable clay aggregate. It's just high surface area rocks, basically.
And another way that David is pushing the limits, he has grafted a tomato plant to a potato plant and essentially made a ketchup and french fry plant.
Limited yields for both, but you do get potatoes down below and a reliable harvest of tomatoes up top.
On top of that, he's got dozens of fruit trees. He is a pretty darn good grafter. If you need to know anything about citrus, this is your guy. Bring him in a piece of fruit, and he can tell you all sorts of things about what it is and its health and everything else. And then, of course, seeds. He knows all about the seeds. He's our seed buyer.
And if we don't have it, ask me. I can do my best to bring it in for you.
All right. Then there is me. I have a 600 square foot veggie garden. I wish it was bigger, but I am a renter, and that is all the space I have to work with. I very much focus on edibles and vegetables, and I really love bringing in beneficial flowers because I really like beautiful spaces. I'm not really a utility vegetable gardener. I want it to be a beautiful place to hang out and also grab a snack. And I also am a total bug enthusiast, so I am happy to have all sorts of bugs in my garden as long as they're in the right balance. Sometimes you have too many pests, and that's always a bummer, not my ideal garden, but I do like to have all sorts of bugs. This is a picture of my garden in the summertime. You can see I plant stuff really close. This is a tomato plant here, and there's a tomato right there too. It's hard to tell, but these are green beans at the bottom. That's an African blue basil, which is a basil that is edible, but its main goal is to just pump out flowers because pollinators go to it. It never stops blooming. And then I have zinnias mostly just for color, but I did find that when I'd go out at night with a headlamp, I'd see all sorts of beneficial bugs eating the pollen of the zinnias. So I knew it was a food source for them, which is pretty nice.
And if you have any bugs that you don't know what they are, take a photo, bring it in, bring it to Aileen. I'd be happy to identify it for you.
Okay, so first we're just going to get to the fun stuff of what you should be planting in the spring. So in front of you, you have a handout that was put together by the wonderful Napa County Master Gardeners. On one side, it's going to have what you should be planting in the spring, and the other, what you should be planting in the fall. So make sure you're looking at the right side that starts with January, I believe. Or excuse me, December. So if you follow the March column down, you can see March is a very busy month, only to be beat by April. So this is really the prime time to get going with your spring and summer veggies. So what else could I say here? So I want to say, if you love broccoli, yes, plant broccoli now. But if you really love corn, tomatoes, melon, squash,
Pumpkins.
this spring time of year is the only time of year you can plant those things, whereas broccoli you can kind of plant year round. So if you're limited on space, you might prioritize those heat-loving crops.
And you'll notice that on this, everything is a little different shade or patterning, and that's whether or not you should plant the seeds, the seedlings, or a more mature plant. And the greens when it's typically the time to harvest. Now, all these rules exist, but the plants don't necessarily know these rules, so there's always slight exceptions.
Depending on the weather we're having, things can change. I will also say this is a plan that's going to be most likely to give you success. You can bend the rules, because on here, for lettuce is a great example. You can see it says plant seeds indoors or in a greenhouse. You can plant lettuce seeds outside or in a greenhouse pretty much year-round and get lettuce year-round.
The germination rate will be slower outdoors in the wintertime, but you often do get success, especially if the daytime temperatures are above 55 degrees in the winter.
So this is going to just be your basic rules, but know that you can really expand off this once you get comfortable or if you want to take a risk. And as David loves to say,
plan for failure, celebrate success.
Yes. All right, so this spreadsheet has kind of some basic options. We want to talk about some of our other favorites that you can plant this time of year. The upper left, we have David's favorite.
Mizuna, which is a kind of mustard, a little bit more savory, not quite as spicy, tons of different varieties. We carry the Miss America very often. It's a beautiful ornamental and super delicious variety of Mizuna.
The way you would maybe cook that is it goes great in like a spring mix salad. You can even blanch it for a lot of kind of Asian foods, maybe a nice broth-based soup. You can even pickle the stems, do a quick pickle on those and add them to a charcuterie board. In general, I highly recommend filling your vegetable garden with things that you are very excited to eat. And then maybe adding one thing that you're just not sure about. Because if you're not excited to eat it, you're probably not going to go take good care of it. And it's always a bit of a bummer when you spend all that time maybe growing it and then it just never gets eaten and just goes right to the compost pile. Okay, another example on here, we have lettuce. A lot of people think when they're growing lettuce, they're going to grow big heads of lettuce. You can do that. But what I like to do is grow lettuce. And then once it gets maybe 20 leaves on it, or maybe even less, you can pick the bottom leaves, always leaving about 6 leaves on top. And you take maybe 6 leaves from each plant. Now you have a giant salad for the next 2 days. And the plant's just going to keep growing. And you can keep just taking the bottom leaves. With time, it's going to look like a tiny palm tree, and that is pretty ideal. As long as the plant doesn't start to bolt. When things start to bolt to make a flower, they get a little bit bitter, which some people don't mind, some people really don't like. You can just keep your lettuce harvest going way longer than if you harvest all the heads all at once.
And that does work for most varieties, but there are some varieties like iceberg lettuce, the really nice clumping ones, that you really want to let it go to be a big head before you harvest. And if you were to plant all of your lettuce as iceberg lettuce, say you planted 30 iceberg lettuce, when it comes time to harvest, you have to harvest 30 heads of iceberg lettuce. So it's important to kind of stagger that out. Be considerate of the harvesting when you're planting.
Do we have a question?
We're supposed to wait till the end.
Nope.
You know, I've read a lot of things and seen a lot of things where people go over with a pair of scissors and just cut the top. Chunk
There
off
are
all the
varieties that can
labels.
do well with that. Like Salanova lettuce, that's a great variety for chopping off the top and letting it go. But you can't cut off all of it. You have to leave some of those bottom leaves in there. And as you grow them, you'll get more familiar with how the growth habits are. So you get really an eye for it as you get more experience.
Yeah, that can be nice, especially if you're growing things in flats, because you can just kind of come through and mow the lawn, if you will. But I want to say the picking technique that I said is most appreciated in raised bed environments. Okay, next up we have some potatoes. Has anyone here ever grown potatoes? Noise. A lot of people that I talk to think a potato is just a potato. Why would I give garden space to a potato? But potatoes are amazing when you grow them yourself. What a lot of people don't realize is that when you get a potato out of the ground and then put it into cold storage, the sugars convert to starches. So if you grow potatoes in your backyard and you eat them right away, it's a completely different flavor profile. It's a completely different texture. You can even harvest the potatoes just as the plant starts to flower, and those are now new potatoes with very tender skins. In fact, the skins are so tender, there is no machine currently known to man that can do it. So new potatoes have to be harvested by human hands. So if you do go to the average grocery store, I want to say any grocery store, and buy new potatoes, they're selling you a small potato variety, marketing it as a new potato. It is not a new potato. So you can get a real delicacy if you grow your own potatoes, and they truly couldn't be easier. Very few pests attack them. You just put them in like a big bucket and let them run, and then you can harvest them as soon as they start to flower or as soon as the leaves die back for your maximum harvest, but it's a real treat.
And some of the best potatoes I've ever grown were accidentally grown in my compost bin. So don't be afraid of them.
You want to go next?
Does anyone know what this vegetable is here?
Kohlrabi.
And what is kohlrabi? How do you use it?
You bake it in the oven, cut
Yes.
in slabs with olive oil, salt, and pepper. It's like a potato with 30 calories.
Absolutely. And
No,
the
it's much better.
the species of that plant is Brassica odoraceae. It's the exact same genus and species as your cauliflower, your kale, your broccoli. It's all just bred for that characteristic, which I think is really cool.
I actually like to eat kohlrabi raw, kind of like jicama. It again works great like on a little vegetable platter. Has anyone ever eaten the stem of a head of broccoli? Where you kind of peel back it's like the best part of broccoli once you learn about it, right? Well, this is like all stem.
Is it a sweet flavor?
It can be sweet, depends on the variety, depends on when you harvest it
And how you cook it.
and how you cook it.
Definitely encourage you.
Up here we have some sage. A lot of people think, oh, I'll plant oregano, I'll plant sage, I'll plant thyme. Know that there are dozens of varieties of both of those things. So you can get a lemon thyme, you can get a tri-colored sage. A lot of them are going to have either different flavor profiles or just add kind of a different beauty and dimension to your growing space. So think about mixing it up. You can get the classics. I want to say a lot of people start with the classics because it feels safe. Do that if you want to, but just know there's so many other options out there. You want to talk about the radicchio?
This plant is radicchio, kind of a bittery lettuce. Has anyone grown it before? How do you use it?
I didn't eat most of it because a lot of radicchio is a lot of radicchio. But you can cut it in slivers and put it on top of a pizza. That's a really nice approach.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Mix it in as a bitter with other more sweet lettuce leaves.
Absolutely.
It grows really well in Napa. I have to say, all the seeds came over.
Yeah, it's really beautiful. I will say a little does go a long way. I will also say that some people are genetically predisposed to taste the bitter more than others. So if you find that you really don't like it, don't push yourself. You don't have, or maybe you do have the gene. I personally know that I'm missing the gene to taste bitter, so I love bitter foods. I'm very, very keen on a good endive salad, and I have eaten with many people who think it's impossible to eat, and I just think it's fantastic. So trust yourself. This last one here is kind of what most people call an endive or an endive. This is an interesting plant. We often sell it in a 6-pack, and it looks kind of just like not super delicious lettuce. The way you get it to look like this is you bring it inside the end of the season, but you plant in the spring, you grow it all summer, the end of the season, you dig it up, you cut off the top, you take the roots of it, you put it in some soil in a dark room, maybe your closet, and then it grows again, a blanched little tender, delicious endive. So if you want a fun project for the winter time, maybe that's something you add to your garden.
Now, any questions at this point? All right.
All right. So we're going to move on to another topic here, which is choosing a planting site. It is really important to know the sunlight exposure in your planting area. Most veggies, especially summer veggies, really appreciate a lot of sunlight. Some things like onions want 12 hours of sunlight to really bulb up. So if you're like me and you're in a limited space, I have essentially 5 vegetable beds. One bed by far gets the most sun. So that is the bed I always prioritize things like melons and pumpkins in, because they have to have that warmth and the sunlight in order to actually give a good result. If you have a shadier space, you might consider doing in the summertime lettuces, herbs. Small tomatoes like cherry tomatoes grow much better in a shady location than big fat heirloom tomatoes. So I would encourage all of you, if you haven't yet, to go out and do a sunlight study in your garden and really see how the sun moves through it throughout the day. If you have a bed that only gets maybe 4 hours of sun, pack that with your leafy greens. That's not where you want to put your sun-loving things, obviously. There are apps you can download to help you with this. I have one called Sun Seeker. It cost me $10. For me, that was totally worth it. For you, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Ooh, you got a good example there. Oh, a free one. Very good.
And what's it called?
I don't know. I'll ask my husband.
All right.
Send him the picture. But it shows summer and winter. It actually is located in my house. So that's my backyard.
That's
and
awesome.
it shows the pattern and sun.
And more resources like that are coming out all the time. So don't be afraid to do a Google search or ask a forum or come in and ask us if we find new options.
Mm-hmm. Another good point is that the sun does change throughout the seasons. As you probably know, summer sun is very high in the sky. Winter sun is very low in the sky. For anyone who's a little disoriented right now, that is east, that is west. The sun is going to go from east to west. So you want to take these things into consideration. Another thing you might consider when you're choosing your planting site is it's safe from deer and gophers, because deer and gophers have nothing better to do with their day than come and eat your vegetables. And you don't have all day to defend your vegetables. So how many people here have any concern about deer? Just one, great. What about gophers? Ooh, okay. And in the past, how have you dealt with gophers?
Live with them.
Live with them.
Cry when they
Very peaceful of you. Yeah, gophers can be pretty dramatic in a vegetable garden. I have some friends who have gopher issues, and they'll just look out their window and see a pepper plant kind of like wiggling, and they're like, "What's going on?" And then it just goes whoop,
Waves
underground,
goodbye.
and it's all that work and just gone. So you can plant things in gopher baskets. You can put things in containers. But if you say had a raised bed, you'd want to put what's called hardware cloth on the bottom of it to keep things out. That way roots can go through, but gophers can't come in. If you were to use something like chicken wire, that would probably work for maybe the first year, probably not even quite the full year. Chicken wire tends to break down.
That's what we made the mistake with the
Yeah.
the chicken wire.
So hardware cloth has kind of a strange name considering what it is, but it usually has a 1/2-inch grid square on it. You can buy it at almost any hardware store, any big box store, or even
Outdoor Supply Hardware might have it.
Yeah, it comes in a roll. I highly recommend using heavy leather gloves when you're dealing with it because it can be a little bit sharp, and then getting tin snips to cut through it. And then when you are lining, say, the bottom of a raised bed, give it a little bit of an extra skirt and either fold that up over the sides or put it out extra wide because it takes a hole about that big for a gopher to wiggle in.
And they tell their friends how to get in.
They do. Okay, any questions about where you should be planting things?
I just wanted to ask if you have any suggestions about squirrels.
Ooh, squirrels. Any suggestions about squirrels? So squirrels love to dig holes. Sometimes that is to bury something, and sometimes I swear they're just taking a peek at the roots to see what's going on down there.
They're curious and mischievous.
What I do in my garden for squirrels and also cats, which can be a pain in the butt, is any bare earth I cover with something. Sometimes that is a plastic tray that we have in our bedding department, which we can give you for free if you ever want. They're 16 inches by 16 inches. You can put decorative stones maybe, like if it's a smaller pot. You can use any sort of metal mesh, but anything you can do to keep them from scratching. So you might do a ground cover of something that's going to spread really low, like a golden oregano, because if it's not loose dirt, cats don't want to use it as their potty area. If it's not loose dirt, squirrels are less likely to be digging in it.
Mm-hmm. And for non-edibles, applying things like cayenne pepper, pepper oils, things that they might taste on, that spice is going to deter them. Not a guarantee. They get used to it too.
Yeah. Pretty much the same for cats. I will say cats do not like the smell of chocolate, and you can source cocoa mulch, which is the shell of cocoa seeds. It smells like chocolate, and a lot of animals don't like it. I'm trying to think of the downsides of cocoa mulch. It's one of those things that can mold a little bit easier. So if you had a really shady, high moisture area, you might get some mold growing on it, which isn't the end of the world. Mm-hmm. But that works really well to keep cats out. No, cocoa mulch should not hurt plants. Yeah.
Now, shredded cedar has a chemical called fugane in it, which deters some pests. It can cause respiratory issues for like chickens and dogs, so I wouldn't recommend it as a bedding for a enclosure, but it's a great mulch. And cats don't like to scratch at it, apparently.
It's hot in their paws, they don't like it.
So bed prep. When starting a bed prep, what's the first step typically? What's something that you guys do prepping your bed? Compost, mulch, soil builder. Soil builder is great. There are resources typically going into the beginning of the season. You don't know exactly what's present. You have a good idea knowing what you planted, but if it's entirely new to you, you don't actually know what's present. And there are now resources that we have here to take samples, send them out to a lab, and they'll tell you exactly what's present in your soil. It's a little pricey. It's $46.99 here, but you'll know the NPK, you'll know what kind of trace minerals. There are even tests that tell you about potential pathogens. So that's something that I like to recommend at very least doing once in your vegetable bed, just so you have a really good foundation. If you've been gardening in it for decades, no problems, you know what's going on, not necessary. But if you're really concerned, it's an excellent resource. Takes a little bit to get back to you, but I think it's really cool to know what's going on exactly in my bed. And so in raised beds, typically you have potting soils, which are high in woods, fibers that tend to break down and compact. So adding products like the bumper crop soil builder is an excellent way of revitalizing it, kind of getting it nice and full again. But it's easy to overdo it. You want to do somewhere between 25 to 50% at the very most. And that really refreshes the bed, as well as providing beneficial microbes to your vegetable garden. There's another thing you could do, like cover cropping, allowing your beds to rest, applying a green mulch like fava beans, vetch, or OSB, letting those plants grow in, and then cutting them, slightly tilling them in, and letting them decay. And that's kind of a natural way of adding in that nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium back into your soil.
I need to build up more soil in my raised bed,
Mhm.
but I don't want to overdo the soil builder. What would you recommend to mix with that?
I would, if you have native soil that you've been planting into it, I would mix that with the soil. Native soil being the soil that's previously in your either ground or beds.
But if I could build it up quite a bit, won't that over?
If you're doing more than 50%, it would.
Okay.
If you're lower than 50, then I'd probably do somewhere around 25 personally, but you can go more than that. You can also mix in our planting mix, which we don't have out here. Planting mix comes in the green bag. That is soil ready to go. So if you need to do 50% or more, you can do the planting mix, or if it's in a raised bed, the bumper crop potting soil is excellent. Not the best for in the ground, but it's very good for raised beds with good drainage.
And for anyone who's not familiar, this bumper crop in the red bag is compost that is pre-mixed with fertilizers. Question?
I have a question about cover crop.
Yeah.
When do you cut it? What's the...
Depends on what kind of cover crop you're using. There's different methods, like mustard cover crops are typically more for weed prevention, preventing other plants from taking hold. So you can cut it at any time. You can let them grow and flower. Now fava beans, they're a legume that fix nitrogen. If you grow a fava bean cover crop and it grows, flowers, and starts to make your fava beans, it's actually going to take up more nutrients than it's putting in. So it's important to cut those down when they're flowering. Right when you see those flowers going, that's the time to till them in.
Okay. Is it red clover?
Red clovers, I'd probably do it right as it flowers as well.
Mm-hmm. And cover crops in general are most commonly applied in the fall, so it's something to do with the end of the season.
And it allows your bed a season of rest. So it's kind of not doing much, allowing the bacterias, the funguses to really do their thing.
So, I'm confusing the timing. If you're trying to do the fava bean and turn it into your soil, you grow them during the summer and then in the fall?
If you were to do that, you'd be planning for a fall vegetable bed. If you're planning for a spring vegetable bed, I would do it in the winter. So starting in the mid-fall, late fall, let it go through the winter, and then
Mix it in March, but then can you still plant right
you
away?
can.
Oh, okay. I thought you were saying numbers.
No, you, as soon as you till it in, you can plant in it.
So I have my backyard. It's kind of like really muddy and like it retains a lot of water.
I imagine a lot of clay.
Yeah. So I tried growing cover crops and for some reason it didn't work for me.
Then with,
So I don't know how I would be able to amend that.
with the heavy clay, it's a long process. It's probably going to need a few years of just cover cropping. I would do it both amendment and cover cropping if you want to go the cover crop route, adding in things that are going to hold onto that moisture, break up that clay, add aeration as well. So like sands are a great additive to it. I wouldn't do any potting soils, but like a topsoil plus can be a good option. Bumper crop soil builder is my personal favorite. Really good at breaking up that clay. Our gold rush as well as pay dirt are good ways of doing it. And mulching, having a wood media on top. As that breaks down, it's going to leach through, slowly break it up, but it's a long time game. It's not going to happen instantly, especially with the clay here. So I might recommend even doing a few raised beds in that area.
Okay. Because I also saw this guy on YouTube called Charles Dowdy, and he throws cardboard and then he throws a lot, like about 5-6 inches of like compost, and he grows on top of that.
Yeah.
So I was thinking maybe that I could probably do that, but also with these rains right now, I've had a lot of like puddles all over the place. So I don't know how I would be able to fix all that.
You
I
have
don't know
to.
if that would actually help if I throw the cardboard and put like 5-6 inches of compost.
No, it definitely could help. I would recommend leveling as you can, because if you have that just clay, you're gonna have puddles. If there's dips in there, the water's gonna collect. So leveling the area, evaluating how the water flows, and kind of planning your plantings based on where that water pools and maybe say you know this one spot, you get a nice big puddle every time, build a bigger mound on it. You can also look into hugelkultur. That's literally making wood piles with compost.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
But in general, yeah, Charles Dowding is a great YouTube channel to follow, especially
Yeah,
if you
it's
like
something-
no-till gardening, organic gardening. Very inspiring guy.
Yeah.
All right, fungus.
Fungus.
Say his name again.
Charles Dowding. He has a gorgeous English accent. It's great to watch late at night to calm down.
All right, and fungus. What are your guys' opinion on fungus in the garden? Let's get a poll of hands. How many people like fungus in their garden? I love fungus in the garden. Fungus is a sign of healthy soil biology. Most funguses in the garden are beneficial. Most funguses that we have do not actually feed off of your plant. If you see a fungus growing on your plant, that's a different subject. There's three main categories of fungus. There's saprophytic, parasitic, and mycorrhizal. The saprophytics are the ones that you see most commonly in your vegetable beds. And that's things that are feeding off of the decaying material in the bed, the wood, the roots, and they're actively breaking it down. Without them, that bed would go anaerobic, get super stinky, it wouldn't be healthy. So seeing little mushrooms pop up in your vegetable beds are actually a really good sign that you have good soil biology.
I think this would be a good time to talk about organic fertilizer.
Yeah.
So organic fertilizing, which is what we recommend for vegetables, relies on fungus to work. So on the back of all these organic fertilizing bags, it's going to say something like contains 224,000 CFUs per gram of each of the following 6 species of fungus. Lots of fungus. If you had, say, something like blood meal, which is a great organic fertilizer, and you were to just put that straight into the average potting soil, which is sterile, it would do nothing because there is no fungus and bacteria and ectomycorrhizae to make the organic fertilizer work. So I personally have had the example, or I've made the mistake of having a big half wine barrel where I was planting potatoes, put in a bunch of blood meal, or it was actually garlic, because I wanted a bunch of green growth on my garlic, and it just didn't happen because I had a sterile potting medium and no fungus. So the way I like to think about it is organic fertilizers themselves are gasoline, and then all of the life in the bag is the engine to get it to run. So you really do need both. The other thing is when we say fungus, we don't necessarily mean mushrooms. Very few fungus make a mushroom. Most fungus just hang out below ground helping out plants.
Mushrooms are the fruiting bodies of fungus. So if you were to compare them to a tree, the mycelium is the tree, the mushroom is the apple. And not all trees make apples.
And to make one more note on fungus, there is one type of plant that does not have a relationship with fungus. So if you were to give it a bunch of mycorrhizal, if you were to give it a bunch of like mycos, which is a brand we have inside the store that is just one specific fungus, it's not going to do anything. So brassicas, broccolis, cauliflowers, Brussels sprouts, kohlrabi, they don't have the handshake that all the other plants have with the fungus. In fact, the fungus is going to suck up the nitrogen and then wait for a plant to hand it off to, but the brassicas never take it up. So I also made this mistake where I once got a free packet of Mycos fertilizer and thought, well, if a little is good, a lot must be better, and filled a whole bed with this little powder stuff that's supposed to make your plants grow better. Planted all my brassicas in the fall, and they just sat. They never really grew. I couldn't figure it out. Luckily, I have a brother who's a soil scientist, and he was like, well, duh. Brassicas don't like fungus, and you filled the whole place with fungus. And I was like, now I know that, okay. So in general, this sort of fertilizer is not going to hurt your brassicas. But if for some reason you really wanted to get a lot of life into your beds, you might lean less heavy on the beds where you're growing brassicas.
And now, just because there's fungus present in these soils or the fertilizers doesn't mean that they're necessarily bad for brassicas. Things like our mycos, which is Rhizophagus interdices, that's a mycorrhizal fungi that you can inoculate onto your roots themselves. Those are things you really want to avoid. And that product, don't have it right here out here right now. We can show it into the store if you go inside.
Would you add that food?
I like to.
In the soil before you plant? Or
You could. I'm more partial to applying it about 2 weeks after planting, especially if you have a rich, well-amended soil.
You said there are 3 types of funguses?
Yes.
What are the other 2?
So there's saprophytes, which feed off of the dead and decaying material. There's parasites, which feed off of living hosts, oftentimes killing them, then turning into saprophytes. And then there's mycorrhizal. Like the mycos product, the Rhizophagus interdices, is a mycorrhizal fungi that, in most conditions, has an exchange with plants. So it's both beneficial to both parties. Yeah.
Is there like a sawdust look in the soil? When I dug in the soil, I didn't know what it was.
So living fungus in your soil is probably going to look like cobwebs or maybe like a white spongy material.
Mm-hmm.
When
No, if
you
there is
apply it, it
sawdust,
looks kind
you
of
can
more
find it in
like
there.
gritty sand. Yeah, it can take you by surprise, huh? Mm-hmm.
just to go back to the earlier thing we were talking about the soil, so if you have like a new container, you're gonna plant it, would you say you would start with all potting soil then, or would you put some of the?
So a container that's completely empty, I would do just the bumper crop potting soil. Because that is rich, ready to go. After a few seasons, maybe after a season of tomatoes, then I would amend it.
And a hack that I've heard some seasoned gardeners say is to add a few handfuls of healthy garden soil that has all the life in it. Because that life is now going to inoculate the rest of the container. So that can be kind of a workaround.
So the other thing I do, and I want to finish when it's master gardening, I've got like 8 different beds on top. So switch your soils around. So I take my wheelbarrow and gently plant the same thing, the same container,
Mm-hmm.
year after year. So I just take like a third of each one out and then mix it all. And then,
Yeah, that,
seems to do pretty good.
that can be a good way of kind of spreading the love of beneficial bacteria and fungus. One thing to consider in that is if you have a soil-borne disease, so you have Brazilian wilt in your tomatoes, then you're just spreading it to that area. So it's a great option if you know that you have healthy soil going from place to place.
Any other questions? Yeah?
And so, courtesy of the city of Napa, I'm doing worm composting also, which means I have a lot of worms.
Ah.
You know, and you don't always get rid of them when you're seeding things out for food.
Uh-huh.
So is it harmful to these raised beds to have the red worms go into them?
Not at all.
They're
No, red worms
beneficial.
are great.
They add aeration, they break down the available nutrients as well, and they're also kind of self-controlling. If you have too many red wigglers, their food sources disappear, they don't thrive, their bodies decay and become nutrients for the plants and the bacteria and fungus is present.
And then a good thing to mention on earthworm castings here is if you were to buy a bag of earthworm casting, they're only very beneficial if you put them in the planting hole. If you were to just scatter them on top, they're not going to do anything bad, but you're not really getting the full benefit out of them.
And
Same
the
thing goes
fresher
if
the
you've got
better.
your worm castings from home, but you have the benefit of having like the worm juice, which you can,
Once a year, they give away a kit for free.
yeah. They're going to be having some classes this year. I think the dates are coming out soon. But yeah, you can make a tea with that worm juice with maybe hopefully some rainwater or some non-chlorinated water. And you can actually mist that or rain that down on your garden, especially in the morning before 10 a.m. That's when the stoma on the underside of leaves are still open. And that's a great way to fertilize your plants from actually their leaf side rather than their root side.
You put a little earthworm around in the openings when you plant the plant.
So yeah, when you're planting something like this and you wanted to use earthworm castings, you would put a little pinch in your planting hole, then tuck this in too. Yeah, if you spread it on top, it basically kind of oxidizes and often blows away.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it really needs to come in contact with the roots if possible.
Let's see, like the wood mulch.
Mhm.
After a while, it kind of gets that white spongy, maybe what you was talking about.
Mhm.
Is that fungus there?
That would be
No,
fungus
fungus.
growing on your
I'm
mulch,
just
yeah.
gonna mix up with my earth then?
You could mix it up or leave it be and let it decay. As it decays, it's just going to leach nutrients down further into the soil, benefiting your plants.
Love roly-poly bugs too.
Oh yeah, they love it.
Yeah.
And
really
having that
close
kind of
to
stuff keeps those critters happy and full as opposed to going to your plant roots.
All right, let's move on. Seedlings. Seedlings versus seeds. So what are some benefits of seedlings, David?
One benefit of seedlings is quick in the ground. You go to the store, you see what you want, you put it in the ground, it's planted, which can be really nice. The cost is a little bit higher. You sometimes can get really excited and go, oh, this plant is huge. This is happy. I want it in the ground. I put it in the ground. The plant goes, this isn't what I'm used to, and then bolts, and you have to go buy new ones. Over here we have some examples of some cabbage and some lettuces that are a little bit past their prime. Even though they look pretty good overall, you can see the leaves are getting much smaller. If I were to take this home, put it in the ground, there's a very good chance it's just going to send out one nice flower.
So not even a very talented gardener is going to get good results with plants that look like this. So this is meant to be a salad bowl variety of lettuce, and if you look closely, this lettuce plant here, here's how it would look if you took it out to plant it. Do you see how there's like a stem growing? Lettuce really needs to stay tight and loaded in the ground. This is already what is called bolting. Bolting lettuce can actually look kind of cool because it looks like a Christmas tree, but it's not delicious.
It's very bitter.
So this is a sign of a plant that's been living in its six-pack too long. It's been stressed out, and quite frankly, this is fantastic for rabbit food or a compost pile, but I would not spend any money on this. Contrast that with this guy. You can see these are tight little rosettes. This would be quite ideal to put into your garden.
Absolutely.
You can't put the tops of those down and really get thicker at the bottom.
There's a chance of it, but if you're buying a six-pack, you're paying a kind of a premium
Can you
for
repeat
it.
questions for everyone so that the camera can hear and also the back can hear? So your question was?
If you clip the top on what it reproduces,
So clipping the flowers, clipping the tops off of your seedlings,
you're taking a chance.
you're taking a chance.
So I have taken chances in the past. I don't want to say I'm an expert, but I kind of know what I'm doing, and I've never had it work out very well. It's never been satisfying. So at some point in the season, if you were to come shopping for veggies in, say, July, that's kind of, if you look at your planting chart, past when a lot of things are supposed to be getting in the ground as far as spring and summer vegetables, you might see some things like this on the shelf, and I would encourage you to pass them by. Unless you're feeling rich and you want a fun project.
Yeah. Or ask us. Ask an employee here. We want success for our customers. So if we think a plant's not going to thrive, we'll be honest with you. Another thing to consider with buying seedlings is oftentimes plants will come with multiple plants in one container. And there's a few things you can do with that. If you were to take this plant, plug it in, you'd get probably a few heads of happy little lettuce, but when they get to maturity, they are crowded. So you want to evaluate that and either thin them out, so planting it, see which ones are doing the best and remove the rest, or if you want to get really complicated, pop it out, put it in some water with some chopsticks, and delicately divide out each individual plant and then space them out. And that can give you a much bigger yield. In my aquaponic system, because it's all bare root, I'll buy a six-pack, and sometimes there's 25, 30 things of lettuce in one cell. I've gotten 150 plants from one six-pack before. So be aware of that when you're shopping too.
So there's some vegetables like lettuce where you can really manipulate the roots and they don't mind. Other vegetables are going to have more delicate roots and they do not want to be teased apart. Some examples of those would be?
Things like root vegetables have a harder time doing it. When you plant them, you have to really be selective. If they're deformed going into it, they're going to be deformed later in life. A non-edible plant, but like poppies, poppies have glass roots. If you're planting poppies in your garden and you're dividing them out, touching those roots, they're just going to fall over.
And then also things like melons and squash.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you'll get a little 4-inch container with 5 plants in it. Instead of picking them apart like we're recommending you could do with the lettuce, instead of pulling 2 out, we actually recommend you very gently snip maybe 3 out. Do not disturb the roots on those plants because the plant might not recover.
Yeah.
In fact, buy a little 4-inch squash if you must, but we would really recommend you do that from seed just because the roots are so particular.
Cucumbers included, melon, squash, all of those gourds, the vining crops typically. Tomatoes, though, if you're not starting them from seeds, tomatoes are an excellent seedling starting plant. When you go to plant them, there's so much you can do with them. Having a big established plant is actually beneficial with tomatoes because they have the benefit of adding roots to their stem. So if you were to buy this guy, you could snip off the leaves down to here, remove all of that, and plant it that deep. Or lay it sideways, have the tip sticking out, and everything underground is going to develop roots and give you a much stronger plant long term.
Having a big root system on a tomato is beneficial because in the summer when it gets so hot, the bigger the root system, the better the whole plant is going to be as far as its resiliency to hot weather. So yes, planting tomatoes deep is fantastic. What else can be planted deep? You can plant marigolds deep. You can plant brassicas deep.
All your brassicas, they're not going to send out new roots, but they'll be a lot more structural. They'll have a better foundation for growing out. If you plant them in their kind of leggy beginning, they'll fall over and then start growing. But if you plant them real deep, they'll just keep going up.
Any questions on this topic?
Can you recommend what plants complement each other in the garden that you would plant to eat plus each other?
Yeah, we're going to have a companion planting section coming up.
So seeds, timing, and storage. Knowing how long your seeds last in certain conditions is important, and that's especially important if you're harvesting your own seeds. So keeping them in cool, dark areas will really elongate their life. And that's about cool and dark is what they want.
Cool, dark, refrigerator, freezer.
With low humidity.
Low humidity, I actually wouldn't keep them in the refrigerator or the freezer, depending on certain varieties. A garage is a better place. You want like a cooler room temperature.
So all the information you need to grow seeds is usually on the back of the pack. Usually it says how many days until the seeds germinate. Use that as a guide, but know that there are going to be factors like temperature that might affect it. Carrots, some people, like this guy over here, say that carrots are so easy to grow. I am in the opposite camp. I think carrots are tricky to grow. The reason he thinks they're easy to grow is because you scatter them.
I scatter them everywhere. So I have a lot of carrot failures, but I also have a lot of carrots. I have 9 citrus trees in 15 or 20 gallon containers. I'll just throw some seeds in there every now and again, and then when they're big and happy, I'll pull them out. That'll aerate the soil, put a little bit of fertilizer back in. I also kind of use them as a tell when my citrus needs water, because the carrots are going to get sad before the citrus does.
I tend to be a little bit more of a perfectionist. I like my things in a row. So carrots take something like 21 days to germinate. That whole 21 days, they need to be moist, but also have sunlight touching them. That can be quite difficult in all but 3 to 4 months of our weather here. Even though you can grow carrots year-round in Napa, you might need to do something to keep them moist. So in my garden, historically, I have done like a layer of newspaper on top. That also lets me water them from above without disturbing the seeds. Because I'm not joking when I say sometimes I really want things in a very straight line. There is also a fun product called seed tape, which is no carrots there, but we could do beets as an example. So seed tape comes in a normal looking seed packet, but it's actually, when you take it out, like a piece of tissue paper, a long streamer with perfectly spaced seeds in it. Very handy for seeds like carrots that are so tiny Beets are actually big seeds, but people do like to space their beets. A thing about beets to keep in mind is one beet seed usually grows into 3 to, I think, 5 beet plants. So as Charles Dowding is a good proponent of, close planting can work if you have great soil health. But if you just have normal soil health or maybe subpar soil health, you really want to thin those beet seedlings to one plant every few inches.
We have it for radishes, we have it for carrots, lettuce, mesclun, we have and spinach. And you can also make your own as well by taking newspaper or light paper in general, placing your seeds down, folding the paper over, and painting it with cornstarch. It is hard. That's why it's nice to have them available. Another thing to consider with carrots and radishes specifically, since carrots take 21 plus days to start germination, planting your radishes right next to the carrots will allow you to have a plant growing in that exact space, and then by the time the carrot is just popping out, you have a radish to harvest.
Fun tricks. So like I said before, all the information you need to sow seeds is often on the back of the packet. Peppers are a great example. If you put pepper seeds in the ground, they very well are not going to germinate because they want something like 72 degrees to get those seeds to pop open. So a heat mat indoors is usually your best bet. I want to say things like peppers and eggplants are probably the hardest things to start by seed. So do it if you want, but maybe have your backup seedlings to pop in the ground just in case things aren't running on schedule. Because those are both things that you have to grow during our warm months. You can't grow them in the winter unless you have a greenhouse or something like that. Okay.
Are carrot seeds the same as the seeds you were talking about, where one seed can produce 4 to 5?
No, one carrot seed will produce one carrot. Now there is a chance of them deforming and sending out 2 little legs or kind of a wonky shape to it, but it'll still be one carrot.
Talk about the ones that are difficult to grow. What are kind of easy, successful seeds?
Radishes,
Usually big
lettuce.
seeds, if you've ever done a project with like preschoolers, so beans, peas, where you can just pick them up and plop them in. Mm-hmm. Super easy. I want to say all the squashes and melons come up so quickly.
Absolutely.
Yeah, lettuce, as long as you're not trying to get every single seed to germinate, sprinkle a line, lightly cover it. It'll say this on the back of the seed packet, but some seeds you plant deep, some seeds you plant on the surface. A good rule of thumb is if you have a seed that's this thick, you plant it that thick plus 1 down. So a pea seed you plant maybe 3/4 of an inch down. A lettuce seed you just barely cover. Lettuce seeds are very tiny, almost like dust.
You blow them and you spread 50 of them.
So radishes, I don't think of being as that small as seeds. They're kind of like little balls. But if you did have a hard time picking up those little balls, you could potentially get like a wet paintbrush and just carefully dab a seed and transfer it. Or if you have any like preschoolers or elementary school kids in your life, invite them over for a planting party. So they got the perfect little fingers for that project. All right, we're going to move on to spacing and layouts.
Quick, Ted, what I do, I like to scatter them like in a paper plate or something, then wet my fingertip and just
Yeah, any sort of wet, a fingertip is actually probably easier than a paintbrush, you're right.
No.
Thanks for the tip. Okay, so it sounds like most of everyone here is doing things in raised beds, but in raised beds or in the ground, you want to think about your spacing and your layouts. The way a lot of us were trained up, this was actually put up by the US government after World War II. This is vegetables for a family of 4 to 7. I don't think anyone in this room is planning to do this. This is an example again of my garden. This is one small bed. This doesn't exactly show the size of the bed, but this was approximately 3 feet by 6 feet. And some other good examples of interplanting, thanks to Homestead Design Collective out of Sonoma, is these are beautiful gardens that are also edible. So if you look here, this is thyme, this is basil. These are peas coming up with a tomato behind it. The tomato cages are these beautiful obelisks. Here you can see more thyme, more oregano. oregano, I believe. That right there is a brassica of some sort, so maybe a broccoli sprouting. They've also incorporated roses. So you can really do beautiful things with your vegetable garden. You don't have to do things in a row. If you group them, put low in the front usually, tall in the back, and then certain things like tomatoes, you want to make sure they're not going to shade out other things. So maybe think about where the sun's going to hit them so they don't shade anything else out. Again, here's another example. This is absolutely beautiful. It could be just an ornamental garden, but actually everything there is edible. So here is a quick and dirty example I made up. This is an example of a 3-foot by 6-foot bed. It has 2 tomatoes, 6 bush beans, 6 heads of lettuce, 7 strawberry plants, 4 French marigold plants, 5 alyssum plants, 3 basil plants, and 1 zucchini. You could also just put 3 tomatoes in this and be done. But if you have, or you're working with limited space like I am, this is not only going to be a good use of your space, it's also going to be quite beautiful and bountiful looking. There are some tricks to making this work. If you notice the little directional sign there, this is the north side of the bed. Everyone knows probably the north side of things are usually the shady side versus the south side is the sunny side. A lot of things are going to grow towards the sun. So if you were to plant, vines are a great example. You plant a vine here and you want it to grow over an arbor that way, it's going to be perpetually leaning towards the sun. But if you have an arbor, you plant the vine on that side, it's going to grow over the vine naturally. I said that with the wrong words, but I think you know what I'm trying to say. So this zucchini would make no real sense to plant it on this side. You want to plant it on the sun side because it's going to send out its tendrils over the edge of the box and crawl towards the sun. Again, these tomatoes in the middle are going to grow tall. Some tomatoes, well, that's a great example right here. Let me just grab this. This is your average tomato cage. Some tomatoes are going to grow this tall. You know, you stick it in the ground to there. Not very many tomatoes grow this tall. I personally call this a pepper cage. I usually use a tomato cage more like that or that plus another trellis attached to the top. Depending on your tomato variety, like a yellow pear tomato is going to grow something like 9 to 11 feet. So you got to be really prepared to support that tomato. Okay, I digress. So you have 2 tomato cages in the middle or some sort of trellising system. So the sun is going to start on the east and then go over to the west, right? So by afternoon, those tomatoes are casting shade on our lettuce. Our lettuce is happy for that afternoon shade. And what's getting sun in the afternoon is those green beans. They are so happy for that afternoon sun. You could swap the lettuce and the green beans, and I bet you wouldn't have as good of results. You can also see that the strawberries are on the north side. They don't mind a bit of shade at all. They're going to still give you fruit. You can see the marigolds are tucked pretty close to the underside of the tomatoes. There's not a lot of companion planting rules that have science to back them up, but French marigolds specifically have stinky roots. Stinky roots do not deter bugs that like to attack tomato roots, but they do kind of hold up like a invisibility sheet. The bad bugs can't see the tomato roots because all they see is that stinky, stinky marigold root. So it's good to do an underplanting of marigolds, French marigolds specifically with your tomatoes. And if you think there's no room for marigolds underneath my tomatoes, well, a best practice for tomatoes is actually to prune off the bottom 18 inches of leaf. That way, no soil is going to ever splash up and hit the leaves, because there's actually a lot of blights that come from the soil that start on those bottom leaves and just slowly creep their way up your tomato plant. So the more room you can give underneath your tomato once it has grown to a nice sizable height, the better option you're going to have.
I have a quick question. Do you trellis your beans?
Depends on the type of beans. In this case, these would be bush beans. Some bush beans almost do need a trellis, but in this situation, they could either flop over the side, or you could kind of string them up if you need to. The last thing on here is the alyssum. This is an example of alyssum here. There's quite a few flowers we sell in 6-packs in the summertime that you might have just walked by. And they're there for a reason, though. So alyssum is a great plant because it provides a home for all of the beneficials that you want. So I tucked that all around the sides. You could even add a couple more to give it a little bit more balance. But this is going to have a purpose and add beauty.
So when the bed is small, I mean, you're pretty much ignoring all those rules about space, plants so far.
You're pushing the boundaries.
So this is like a creative solution to get you more, because that zucchini, if you planted it right in the middle of the bed, it would take over the whole bed probably. There's certain varieties that are more mounding than sprawling, but this is because it's on the edge and we know it's going to want to grow towards the sun. It actually only needs about this much room in your bed, and then it's going to put its legs, if you will, outside the bed. So the footprint of this whole garden space is bigger than 3x6, but the actual soil footprint is 3x6. This is a raised bed or in-ground. In my garden, I actually have in-ground beds that are 2 bricks high. I kind of built a little border around them. So I say that I plant in raised beds, but it's kind of a hybrid of both. You want a raised bed to be at least 18 inches, with 18 inches of soil. A lot of people don't fill their raised beds enough. I really recommend you top off your raised beds, unless you had some really, really high, unusual hip height raised beds.
I've tried growing those French marigolds and it's not a
Yes, we got a product for that. So this sort of close planting is going to invite bugs like that because it's going to be kind of a moist environment down below more than likely. So you would want to use probably a product called Sluggo Plus. A lot of things like
The Sluggo is advertised as dog and cat friendly. The active ingredient is iron phosphate. It's something that I would evaluate. If you apply it out and your pet's immediately going for it, maybe keep them away for it for a day or so. But it is something that is advertised as, specifically the Sluggo, not necessarily the Sluggo Plus, advertised as dog and cat friendly.
So Sluggo would work great for your slug problem. In my garden, when I go out at night, because that's when these bugs are coming out, I see pincher bugs eating my flowers and roly-polies eating my flowers. This is the one that's going to work for pincher bugs and roly-polies. This does nothing for cats. You got to use the cocoa mulch for that.
When you're planting like this, when I've always wanted to do it, but one of the things that made me hesitate was water.
Yes.
So, like, is it drip hose? Is it individual drips? How do you personally manage your watering for your plot?
So I have those in-ground beds that I told you about. I ran something that's called Tech Line all through my beds, which is a brown color, and it has built-in emitters every 6 inches or 12 inches, depending on the kind you buy. And those emitters, yeah.
Right, okay.
A lot of times people will do like the black spaghetti line type of drip, and that one's pretty modular, but for this situation, you want probably 2 lines of irrigation going the length with emitters every 6 inches. And then you're going to run your irrigation 7 minutes, something very short, depending on how many emitters you have. You have so many emitters in there, it doesn't take long to really soak things.
Okay.
You said it's called Tech Line?
Tech Line. That is like a brand name. If you go to Horizon Irrigation around the corner and ask for the brown irrigation tubes, they're going to know exactly what you're talking about.
And it has the emitters already
Pre-punched in, yeah. It's pretty good. Unless you had well water, I wouldn't recommend it because you might have some grit in your line, but it's a pretty elegant solution.
Thank you.
I was wondering, you said that purple cage are what you use for all your tomatoes. Someone told us those tall ones that go smaller at the top are only for cherry tomatoes. Are
It
they
goes
for all
taller,
tomatoes?
smaller at the top.
So something like reverse of this, something that instead of going outward goes inward, like these guys.
Yeah.
So with tomatoes, there's lots of different practices. One thing to really consider when planting is it an indeterminate or a determinate tomato? Indeterminate tomatoes are going to keep growing and growing. Whatever structure you give them, they're going to go with. determinate tomatoes are smaller, they're going to get to one size, and that's about it. So for a lot of cherry tomatoes, I believe they're mostly indeterminate. So it's not a bad thing to do. It's not necessarily the only thing you can do though. They're not only for those kind of tomatoes.
So you would recommend the ones that are smaller at the top for all tomatoes?
So I wouldn't actually necessarily even recommend that specific one, just a big tomato cage, bigger than you think. Because when you plant this little tomato, it's going to look silly, right? In just a couple months though, it's going to be this monster with arms that are reaching out to smash everything around it.
With the right support, they can be tomato trees. I've seen those go 15 feet.
Out and over it, and they kind of strangle their own vines.
Now you want to have good airflow and light exposure to all of the foliage. If something's locked inside and covered by its own foliage, that inside's not going to thrive.
So then they should be wider at the top, like cages.
It does not matter wider or more narrow, really. If you did have, like, take it to an extreme and had a pointy trellis, you would then get some twine or some tape of some sort and just kind of corral it as it gets to the top. Tomatoes don't get narrow as they grow up necessarily. They just keep sprawling.
What's really important is how you maintain your tomato, how you prune it, how you shape it. And so you could do either or, but you have to do different methods of care for that tomato for it to be happier.
Like in that picture I showed before, that's like an 8-foot obelisk, which, can you see it kind of poking through? That isn't particularly expensive compared to tomato cages. It gives you extra feet of height. It's kind of beautiful. It doesn't have quite as much support, but really for most tomato cages, you're going to be helping with the support by tying things or corralling them somehow. But yeah, if you're worried about things getting too big, maybe look for varieties that are just going to naturally be shorter.
How many trimmed are tomato plants?
Ah, yeah. So
There's a few different methods. A lot of commercial growers will grow them on strings, and they will pinch them right when they're real young and only allow 2 vines to grow up. And when it gets that size, they stop letting it grow green growth. That vegetative growth or sucker growth is going to limit your fruit production. So with tomatoes, I recommend experimenting with it. Really, if you see that it's growing excessive suckers, and that by suckers I mean bits of growth coming in those nodes right there. So over time, you can see it coming right now. That's going to grow into a potentially 6-foot little vine going out. So by limiting those, you have better fruit production. And down the line, don't be afraid to take photos, bring them down here, talk to us with your plant, so we can really tell you exactly what we think will get you the best success.
Pinch those out.
you can, that's one technique.
It's one technique. There's lots of wrong ways to do it. There's no true right way to do it.
I would not pinch the center out. I would pinch the side shoots out, if that was your goal. So I have a coworker here who grows tomatoes in a long, skinny bed. He plants a tomato every 8 inches. And he has a little post for each plant, and he takes it to a single trunk. So anytime it sends out a side shoot, he pinches it off. So he's growing a ton of tomato plants in a small space, but he's keeping them all very skinny little plants. It's a little bit more work. I wouldn't really recommend it if it's your first time growing tomatoes.
If you're a commercial tomato grower, it's great, but what are you going to do with 400 pounds of tomatoes?
Truly, with a lot of these things, like say you are so excited about zucchini, I would encourage you, plant 1 zucchini plant. You probably don't need more than 1 plant. If you love tomatoes and no one else in your household does, 2 plants will probably do you. You probably don't need that much more.
If you were to, like, let's say, top off the tomato plant, would it kill it? Or
No,
right?
it'll stop growing there, but from the node below where you cut, it'll send out more of that sucker growth, so you'll have a bushier.
You can take care of that and prune it.
Mhm.
Not over that.
Yeah, and for every one of those cuts you make, when you cut off a big, long sucker growth, you can stick that in a glass of water or into a really wet substrate, and it'll root out, and you got a whole new tomato going.
Tomatoes are very forgiving, so don't stress about pruning them. If something just kind of makes sense to you, do it, and it's probably going to work out.
So you've got this whole thing planted, you've got the watering in there. Do you put any mulch on top of that after you've got it all going to keep it cooler?
You can keep some mulch or put some mulch over your irrigation lines. That is going to keep more water in the ground. If you did a nice thick layer of mulch for most of these plants, that would work out. Strawberries do not like to be mulched very deep at all. They like to have their kind of shoulders showing, I call it. Yeah, with something planted this closely, you wouldn't mulch very thickly just because some of these plants don't want to be deep and you want to give them some space around and it doesn't make as much sense. But anytime you can use mulch, you're going to use way less water. Water's not going to evaporate as quickly. Something like potentially 40% less water.
Is there a type that you like?
We have a bumper crop mulch in a black bag.
That's a great product.
I think the best thing we got right now.
Nice big brick. One thing to also consider with companion planting is there are plants that inhibit growth of other plants. Things like sunflowers, walnut trees especially, they're allelopathic. So if you say you plant a sunflower in your garden and you notice that plants aren't doing well around it, take note of that and then look back onto that next year and kind of get your own relationship with these plants and see what grows better together. The more you do it, the better you're going to know what to add in there.
Okay, we are running behind, so we're going to go a little bit faster.
All right.
But here we have some common pests. As I was putting this PowerPoint together, I was laughing to myself because, you know, when you Google strep throat and the pictures you get are like the worst cases known to man. If you walked out into your garden and saw this level of spider mites in your garden, just burn it. Just abandon it. There is no solving that. Same thing goes for whitefly. If you had a whole bunch of leaves with that many whitefly on them, there is no chemical that it's worth using. Just raise it all and start fresh. But these are all very common things that we see in our summer vegetable gardens. Everyone here is probably familiar with aphids. Did you know aphids can be all sorts of different colors? Greens, blacks, orange. Some aphids are very specific to some plants, some are not. Aphids are interesting because you can see in that picture some of them have wings and some don't. In general, what happens is aphids arrive on a plant, make a bunch of babies. Once the population has grown to a certain level, the next generation that emerges out of eggs will have wings, and those ones leave and go to the next plant. So with aphids, what would we recommend, David?
Oils, specifically. First approach, I like to recommend you blast them off with a hose. Remove as many aphids from the plant as possible, and then apply a product like Final Stop, Pest Fighter year-round, neem oil's great, any kind of horticultural oil.
Times when you wouldn't want to use the oil is if you have a bunch of aphids maybe in a head of broccoli, because there's no good way to get the oil out. It would probably just be better to cook those aphids off, worst case scenario later. The other thing I want to mention, since you mentioned blasting aphids off with a hose, a lot of people will say, you don't need to spray, just spray them off with water. Well, that is true, but if the aphid is actively feeding, it has a mouth part that it puts inside the plant, and it is now one with the plant. It is not, you can't blow it off, you can't pull it off, you can't blast it off with water. So that's why it's good to do water first to get most of them, and then oil to get the rest.
And if there's an ant population, those ants are going to pick those aphids up and put them right back up.
So ants farm aphids. So if you see ants on your plant, be suspicious, because the ants aren't there for the pollen, the ants aren't there for the fruit, the ants are farming some other bug. So it's a little indicator that you got something else going on.
Are the aphids that go on all plants? Are there any?
Aphids love tender plants. There are some plants aphids don't prefer, but we're going to talk more about that in a second. Yep.
Just to share, somebody turned us onto this. We had an aphid problem with our tomato plants. And so last year we were told to, I just bought one of the little pony paths of marigolds, and we planted them in the corners of our beds. Didn't have one aphid.
Very good.
And oh my gosh, the colors, I kept taking chunks of them. They keep growing and growing. The plants are beautiful.
Very good.
They were getting too big, so I just would take cut half the plant off, and we never had one aphid. Yeah.
Huh.
An excellent
Can't say I
example of
know-
companion planting.
I don't know any science behind why that worked, but I'm glad to hear that it did work.
And a lot of the science in home garden is anecdotal. We're coming up with new hard facts all the time. I really want to encourage people to experiment, do things like that, make results, and then share that information.
Another bug that's really common in summertime gardens is whitefly. These look like actual little white flies. That's what the adults look like. The way you would test a plant for whiteflies, you just kind of go and like rustle the leaves, and if little white flies pop out, congratulations, you have whitefly. Whitefly is very hard to control with chemicals. What I would first do if I found that I had whitefly in my garden is think, why is this plant so stressed out in the first place? because stressed plants are much more likely to get pest problems. With whitefly, there are sprays that advertise they kill whitefly, but guess what? You spray once, the whiteflies fly away, you can't chase them down and spray them. So it takes repeated sprayings, and with something where you're eating the leaves of the plant maybe, you don't want to be spraying very much, because even if it's organic, you don't want to eat that. So probably first fix the root problem, which is why is the plant so stressed out. Flea beetles here, not super common, but they can eat the leaves of potatoes, sometimes tomatoes. They're not going to really kill the plant. Again, why is your plant stressed out? Why is it being so susceptible to pest problems? Spider mites, that's what happens in my garden all the time. Absolute pain in the butt. Not a very good spray for them other than oil, but it's difficult to spray your vegetable garden for mites because they live on the undersides of leaves. So you have to kind of flip every leaf and spray it.
Or crawl underneath the plant and spray from above with proper PPE.
So not very realistic to control those. With cabbage worms here, they love to eat all your brassicas. They're kind of easy if you like to go out in your garden. It would be worth it about once a week to flip over the leaves of your brassicas, and if you see any yellow tic tacs standing on end, those are cabbage caterpillar eggs, and just kind of smush them off. Because once they do hatch, they are incredibly tiny little worms. And a lot of people just blink and their entire brassica plant is covered in caterpillars with these ratty looking leaves. And they think, it wasn't like that 2 weeks ago. It probably wasn't.
They grow very fast.
They grow fast.
Oftentimes you'll see their excrement, little black dots around the plant or on the leaves before you realize how bad of an infestation it is. Once they're established, it's fairly easy to find and pick off, but you leave one behind, you come by the next day, they've eaten a fourth of your plant.
The last one on here is a tomato hornworm. Tomato hornworms can do a doozy on your tomato plants. They can eat so many leaves so quickly, and they also are strangely good at hiding on the plants. You can go out at night with a black light, and these will glow in the dark. But last year was a very good example of this. There are different species of tomato hornworm. If it's a green worm that eats tomatoes and has a horn on its butt, it's called a hornworm. But before you were to say kill a hornworm eating your tomato, I would either bring it in here or try to get an ID on it, because this guy here is what some of them turn into. This is a native hummingbird moth. They're great pollinators, and last year, because of all that rain we had, we think, their populations boomed. I would go out on a hike and see like 50 in one patch, whereas in years before, I'd feel lucky if I saw one the whole summer. So that looks like a tomato hornworm and is called a tomato hornworm, but that caterpillar would also be so happy to eat ceanothus, almost any California native plant. I think it will even eat something like lovage or dill. So you can just move the caterpillar, if it is our native hummingbird moth, to a different plant in your garden. And then the one on the left here is what a cabbage caterpillar looks like. So if you see a white butterfly in your garden, it's almost certainly an invasive moth that is laying eggs on all your brassicas.
They will hop from brassica to brassica. So if you're all planted in one area, they have an easy time doing it. Any question?
I'm just curious, do you have a pest problem with your garden?
I'd say it's about the same as in-ground garden. Aphids especially, I get a lot of aphids, especially when I do a dump, so every like 6 months to a year, I will clear the water out, remove the hard sediment at the base. Towards the end of that, when it's really full and there's tons of nutrients, aphids are really bad because there's a lot more available sugars. But wipe them off, dust them off, eat a few, they don't bother me.
All right, now we have some common beneficials.
Real quick on the pests.
Yep.
We get white worms with red head on our raised beds.
Okay, like little tent caterpillars. Make like.
And then actually wrap around the.
Mm-hmm.
What do you do with those? Or prevent them?
That would be, I would use BT, which is.
BT is an elegant solution for caterpillars of any sort. It's a bacteria that gives caterpillars a stomachache.
Mm-hmm. That's good for a plethora of caterpillars. It does kill them, so if you're really concerned about the butterflies or moths, it does harm them, but it is a good solution for those problems.
Okay, so yes, quickly.
Just real quick, so if you bring a plant that has like the white flies into your garden or something like that, you don't even know that you're doing that, will that spread out, or is it just affecting that one plant?
It has the potential to spread
Has
out,
potential.
especially because they can fly. They can go, oh, this plant is not a good host anymore, but that one over there is, let's all go.
But if you say had good organic practices, a fun fact about organic gardening is plants growing in an organic environment have thicker cell walls. And so a lot of bugs that have piercing mouth parts, like a whitefly, they don't prefer to eat those strong plants. They want to eat weak plants with weak cell walls. And the way you get weak plants is either stress it out or maybe give it synthetic fertilizer, because that pushes growth so quickly the cell walls aren't beefed up.
I have grubs in one of my raised beds.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a way to get rid of those?
The best way is to hand pick them if you can. You can also water in beneficial nematodes, which is something that's available at garden centers in the springtime.
I can pick them every season.
Yeah. So that's a beetle. That's what a beetle looks like before it's a beetle.
There's tons of different kinds of beetles. It could be June bugs, could be Schaefer beetles. There's a lot of different kinds, and a lot of them are natives too. And they don't always just feed off the roots. They can be feeding off of the wood decaying, they can be feeding off funguses in the soil. Nematodes are a great way of dealing with them. It's often a mitigation, not a true removal. It doesn't deal with all of them. So hand removal as well as the nematodes is my best approach. And if you have chickens, when you're removing them, those chickens are going to be your best friend.
Yeah.
So we're at an hour and a half.
Okay.
Okay, so for beneficials, everyone knows ladybugs, of course, but flies are also great in your garden. Flies are fantastic pollinizers. There are, of course, many types of flies. The ones people are most familiar with are commonly called bottle flies, and they love feces. So you probably don't want those in your garden. But other flies are fantastic to have around. Often our native bees are confused for flies. Sometimes flies can have yellow and white stripes on them and look just like a bee or even a wasp. So if you see something hanging out on your flowers, just assume it's a good guy. You want that pollination. Lacewings are also fantastic. These ones I don't see quite as often, but
They're small.
love to eat aphids. They absolutely love aphids, so they're great to have in your garden.
Spiders are great too. Spiders are indiscriminate eaters, so they're kind of going to eat everything that's there, but they're not going to eat your plants.
Soldier beetles in the middle there, a lot of people think are bad, but a lot of beneficial bugs that are going to eat the bad bugs are going to move quickly on the plant. So if you look at a plant and you see a bunch of aphids, they look like sleepy little cows kind of, right? And you got the soldier beetle running around eating aphids as it goes. So if you see a fast-moving bug, it's probably a good guy. Same thing with syrphid fly larvae. It kind of looks like a cabbage worm, but if you look closely, when you see one of these, you almost always see aphids right next to it because it's having a snack. These guys like to actually pick up aphids and then smack them down. They make me think of like little wrestlers. Other common beneficials, so that guy there in the bottom right turns into this guy here in the top left. Syrphid flies look kind of like a wasp or a bee, but they're fantastic in your garden. How many people know that this is what a ladybug looks like before it's a ladybug? They look like little alligators kind of got dressed up for the 49ers, or the San Francisco Giants game.
And they're often more
So
effective
orange and
predators
black.
too.
So they love to eat aphids. Of course, we got mason bees here. That's a bee that I think most people would think was maybe a fly, but that's a great beneficial bee to have in your garden. Praying mantis.
Another indiscriminate eater. So
They're not bad exactly, but yes, a praying mantis can, say, eat a hummingbird. So, you know.
and there are native praying mantis, but a lot of the ones you see here are Chinese praying mantises.
Maybe a little less ideal.
Yeah, a little bit bigger.
And of course, there's all sorts of native bees and lots of little moths that are fantastic pollinators in your garden. All right, so companion planting. So there is a lot of advice out there from maybe people who are not leaning heavy on the science about what plants grow together with one another. One thing that we do know for sure is that trap crops work great. So trap crops include marigolds, alyssum, nasturtium, dill, lovage, radish. Sometimes they are going to provide a food source for bugs in an earlier life stage before they're the beneficial form of the bug. Sometimes, in like nasturtium's case, they are a more tender, delicious snack for aphids than, say, your tomatoes. So if you plant nasturtiums around, the aphids are all going to hang out on those plants rather than the plants you actually want to eat. We already talked about marigolds and how they can mask the smell of tomato roots. And then, yeah, plants like dill and lovage. These ones are fantastic, even if you're not trying to eat them, but so many good bugs hang out on them. If you were really short on space, you could do something like plant your onions with your strawberries. Those play really nicely together. Supposedly, things like onions don't play as nicely with peas or green beans. But again, there's not necessarily science to back that up.
It's all anecdotal right at this point. That's why it's important to take notes as you go along. See what does well in your landscape.
Yeah, I highly recommend having some sort of notebook or spreadsheet because you always think, how could I forget this? I just planted, I'll never forget it. And you always forget. And it's great to be able to look back. So harvesting is something to consider when you're actually planting because you got to think, if I plant my lettuce and heads of lettuce, am I going to be ready to harvest 6 heads of lettuce all at once? That's a lot of lettuce to deal with. So maybe you want to pick it like leaf lettuce throughout the season. With tomatoes, do you want a determinate variety or an indeterminate variety? Here we sell a lot of indeterminate varieties, but certain varieties are going to be taller or shorter. You might take that into consideration. Because with a determinate variety, all your fruit is ripening at once. So if you have a big canning project, maybe plant a bunch of determinates because they're all going to ripen in the same week. Versus an indeterminate, which is ripening from the bottom up. So you're getting tomatoes ripening all the time. When you are harvesting basil, a lot of people have the instinct to just pick an individual leaf. It would be so much more beneficial to you to pick the whole stem because tomatoes grow with basil grows with opposite leaves. So if you pick a stem right here, you're going to get 2 new stems that grow out. You're going to double your basil just for taking that one, which is just like the best sort of...
The more you pick, the more you get.
Yeah. We talked about potatoes, how you can harvest them when the flowers are just starting. Fantastic way to grow potatoes is right there. It's got a little peekaboo window. If you want to steal some potatoes. And then when you are harvesting, maybe do some research. I always put it out in the Van Winden's newsletter, but store your tomatoes on the counter. Do not put them in the refrigerator.
Also, you can pick your tomatoes when they're 50, 70% red. When they are showing that color, they're fully ripe. You can pick them, and they will ripen off of the vine too.
So if you had issues with squirrels stealing your tomatoes, that might be a way you get around it, because they're going to taste just as good if you pick them at that breaker stage and put them on the counter. So you can get around that. Okay, so let's talk about some products real fast. Like we said before, we really do like organic products. Has anyone here ever used diatomaceous earth or heard of it? So that is an example of an organic product that kills everything. So just because something says organic doesn't necessarily mean it's good in the way that you're hoping it is. Because if you put diatomaceous earth on a butterfly or a ladybug, it's going to kill them. So keep that in mind.
But it does work great. Like my dad's household, we put it around the beehives. Keeps all those creepy crawlies from crawling in. Anything that's not flying in can't get in because of that diatomaceous earth.
Yeah. It can be a little bit irritating, or maybe a lot of it irritating to your eyes. And it doesn't work when it's wet. So you might have to reapply if you have a garden that gets very damp for some reason, like irrigation lines or heavy dew. But it can be a good pest control. Just know it kills everything. So if for some reason you needed to kill everything, which I don't usually recommend, that could be a good option for you. You want to talk about this one?
Yeah.
What's that?
It does. It stops them from getting in. They can't cross over that physical barrier. But if it gets wet, we have to reapply it. This is a product called Calzyme. This is calcium, a super, super fine powder of calcium that we heavily recommend you add into your planting spaces, especially with tomatoes. If you deal with blossom end rot, it's because of lack of calcium.
With the caveat being,
This is Calzyme.
often though there is calcium in your soil, it's just not getting to your plant because you're not watering well.
Or the pH of the soil isn't what it needs to be. So if it's too alkaline, those nutrients can't be accessed by the plant. So if you're planting in heavy clay, this is a good way of treating that and getting them that calcium. But in the long term, evaluating, testing the soil, seeing why those nutrients aren't being accessed is better. There's also two forms of the Calzyme. This is the super fine. This is more of a granular. This isn't as available to the plant, but as it breaks down in the soil, it becomes more available. So doing them in unison, that's a hit right there. The plant has it. This is for the long term. Yes, but you
As
can
we're
also
prepping
apply
your
it
bed.
later on.
Oh, this is your favorite.
Yeah, but has anyone here used Monterey Complete Disease Control? So this
We
is
are
a fairly
really big
new
fans.
product, and I love it. This is a soil-borne bacterial culture that you can apply to the plants as both a preventative and a treatment. There's tons of new literature coming out all the time. This is just recently discovered to be a way of mitigating for leaf curl for peaches and nectarines. It's also excellent for sooty mildew, powdery mildew. So any kind of fungus that's growing on your plant itself, this is an excellent product.
And simply put, this is a bacteria that eats fungus. It's a naturally occurring bacteria in the soil, so you can use it as a soil drench or actually spray it on the plant. So if for some reason you had like a bunch of zucchini growing, maybe some tomatoes, and we got like a really weird late season rain, all that extra moisture on the leaves might actually cause something like powdery mildew to pop up. This would be a great thing to apply right after the rain because that bacteria is going to colonize the leaf and eat up all the fungus before it takes over.
That's Monterey Complete Disease Control.
We've got some neem oils here. We'll
Two
talk about
different
spinosad.
This spinosad is another soil-borne bacteria. It's kind of comparable to BT in certain applications. It's for insects specifically. It's an insecticide, and it's a neurological mode of action. So it affects the insects on a neurological level.
This
And
is
it's
called
broader than BT.
spinosad soap. So all of these products that we've mentioned so far have usually a booklet on the back that you can peel off and flip the pages of and get out your magnifying glass because the words are really tiny, but all the information you need is here. The label is the law. Just because you heard someone use some product for something, you can give it a try, but the label is the law. The label is going to tell you exactly what to expect, how to apply, what safety gear you might need to use, because something like neem oil is an oil from a neem plant. How bad could it be? But this actually does say use some sort of respiratory protection. Some people like me even think it smells good, but you shouldn't be smelling it. You should be wearing your mask.
The more protection, the better. Even if it is a safe product, it's still a insecticide. It's doing harm, and new information is coming out all the time. So it's just better to protect yourself. Error on the side of caution.
And we can talk about some of these products down here. We've got steer manure. Steer manure is probably most popular with the old men who come to grow their onions, I believe.
Nice source of nitrogen, not too hot, hard to overuse. Whereas like chicken manure is an excellent source of nitrogen, but you can burn your plants and cause damage if you use too much of it.
So both of those are going to give you nitrogen. Nitrogen gives you green growth.
It's also the N on that fertilizer, the NPK. Nitrogen is the N.
Or the first number in the 3-number series. So what kind of summer veggies or spring veggies would you want a lot of nitrogen? That's going to be leafy greens. If you were to give a lot of nitrogen to a tomato, you'd get lots of green growth, but maybe no flowers. And if you don't have flowers, you're not going to get tomatoes. So you want to be careful with your nitrogen. Some people go a little bit heavy on that and then wonder why their fruit tree doesn't have fruit or their tomato plant doesn't have any tomatoes. This one here is interesting. This one's called Recipe 420. I'll give you one guess on who it's marketed to. But it is the most fabulous blend of organic fertilizers for raised beds. So if you had a big budget for your project or you really believed in getting set up well from the beginning, fill your raised beds with that stuff. It does cost more because it's got the most premium things in it, but it's a fantastic product. It's compost pre-mixed with all the really good organic fertilizers.
You wouldn't have to mix it with soil builder then. You could use it by itself.
You could use it by itself. Yeah, it's not too hot to plant straight into. The soil builder is too hot to plant most things straight into.
It also has beneficial bacteria. A lot of these products have beneficial bacteria added in.
If you wanted to go super traditional, this is just compost, no fertilizers mixed in at all. Just organic compost here in this orange bag. Bumper crop, as you guys know, fabulous product. We'll have a bumper crop sale coming up pretty soon here where you buy 3 bags and get your 4th bag free. 1 bag usually amends 8 square feet. So you can get 2 bags for usually 2 raised beds, and it's usually the right amount. We've got a great potting soil here, which you just needed to fill up a pot, and Asbest is pretty wonderful for that. And then this one, pay dirt's really popular with, I want to say, a lot of people, maybe in Benicia and Vallejo, because Mid-City talks about pay dirt a lot. What do you think about pay dirt?
It's a great product. It's chicken manure and aged forest materials. It's a good top dressing. You can use it as a light mulch. It's good for water retentiveness, breaking up clay. It's kind of like a softer version of the bumper crop soil builder.
So that would work for me then.
Yeah, that'd be a good amendment for your area.
Would any of them include the casings in any of them? You have to buy the
Earthworm casings are included in the bumper crop and probably the Recipe 420. Are earthworm casings in any of these bagged products? Okay, we're going to end with just some general tips. We've already talked about it, but your average tomato cage is too small to hold a tomato. So you're going to have to come up with a different system. We've already talked about 6 packs of lettuce and can be teased apart to get dozens of lettuce plants. We've talked about planting your tomatoes deep. We've talked about pruning tomato leaves up. At the end of the season, if you are anything but thrilled with how your tomato or with how your garden grew, I highly recommend taking them out, root and all, to see what's going on with the roots. Maybe you see grubs. Maybe you see the roots are kind of glowing, like as if it was mycorrhizae. But in my garden, I once did that and realized it was actually mealybugs sucking on the roots of my plants. It was a very unpleasant surprise.
Plants are icebergs. It's just the tip when you see the plant.
What's that?
Root knot nematode?
Yeah, if your tomatoes weren't performing well, you might have root knot nematode. Thankfully, that's not very common. But if you did see kind of deformed roots, you might figure out why your roots are deformed. Deformed roots never lead to a very happy plant. Okay, this top one here, ipm.ucanr.edu. If anyone ever comes to us and asks us a question and we don't know the answer instantly, that's the website we go to with all the answers. It is run by the state of California. It'll have like the topic of tomato and list every bug and disease that could possibly affect tomatoes. And you can just go down the list and see which one is affecting me. Has every single one. And it's great because it's also location specific. Because we don't actually need gardening advice for like the Midwest. They have totally different bugs, totally different problems. So this one's great and local. If you're ever wondering what it is you're looking at in your garden, I highly recommend the Seek app. A lot of people use Picture This. I do not like it nearly as much as the Seek app. So you can take a picture of a bug or sometimes even a plant. If it's a good picture, the AI on it will tell you what it is you're looking at. And then lastly,
it's very important. Expect failure, celebrate success. We are not going to be experts starting out. You can't expect yourself to do everything perfect. If you're not failing, you're not trying hard enough.
All right, and that is the end of our presentation. Any last questions? Okay.
Just curious, where did you put your hydroponic? Like, is it in the garden?
It's in my father's backyard, actually. It's in full sun. And it's literally 2 cattle stock tanks. I have a 250-gallon cattle stock tank with a 50-gallon cattle stock tank on top of that. That's the grow bed. The big one runs the fish tank. And then there's an aeroponic tower that I built on one side. And it cost less than $300 to make. I went to, so the whole system cost me about $300. I got it from, it's a farm ag supply store in American Canyon. The name's eluding me. Tractor Supply. I got it from Tractor Supply. And it's run off of a bell siphon. It's an ebb flow system. So it's a tube with a tube on top in the main tank with a pump that's constantly flowing into it. So it fills up, the bell siphon activates, it drains the whole tank, and that happens about every 15 minutes.
Did you find like an online site to figure that out? That sounds
I did a lot of failure. A lot of failure.
Organized it didn't work. When are we getting the ladybugs and the toys and all?
Once the temperatures start to warm up, probably around April, I would guess.
It changes every year depending on when spring arrives, which right now it's feeling kind of springish, so maybe very soon. And anyone who hasn't gotten a $10 coupon yet, that should be available at the cashier for you.
My roly-polies in my stock tank, my raised bed, they ate the bok choy seedlings like within 24 hours. I'd rather not use the
Diatomaceous earth?
Yeah, because it's a raised bed.
I would do Sluggo Plus.
Sluggo Plus. How about putting up
Piece of paper.
orange?
You could.
That's what I read.
That's a good way of discouraging them from going to your plant, but it could also bring in more. Yeah, I like the Sluggo Plus personally. There's ear traps you can use too. They're not super effective. A lot of those trapping methods kind of they deter